In the shadowed valleys of Central Europe, where mist clings to ancient forests and church bells toll across cobblestone squares, there once lived a child whose only crime was speaking to the creatures of the wild. Her name was Greta Lenz. She was 12 years old when they put the rope around her neck. Her executioners believed they were saving their souls. History remembers them as murderers. This is not a tale of monsters lurking in dark corners, but something far more chilling. The story of ordinary people consumed by extraordinary fear. It unfolds in the year 1672, when superstition wore the mask of justice, when children's laughter could be mistaken for witches' incantations, and when the simple act of befriending a wounded bird could seal a young girl's fate with hemp and timber. In an age where the line between the sacred and the profane was drawn in blood, Greta Lenz crossed that line without knowing it existed. What followed was not divine justice, but human cruelty dressed in the robes of righteousness. Her story echoes through the centuries, a reminder that the most terrifying evil is often committed by those who believe themselves to be good. In the village of Kleinhardt, nestled between the rolling hills of what would one day become Germany, the world moved to the rhythm of seasons and the solemn toll of church bells. Here, in this forgotten corner of the Holy Roman Empire, cobblestone streets wound between timber-framed houses like arteries through a sleeping giant. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying with it the scent of burning wood and the whispered prayers of the devout. It was into this world that Greta Lenz was born on a winter morning in 1660, when frost painted delicate patterns on window panes, and the midwife's breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Her father, Johann, was a carpenter whose calloused hands could coax beauty from raw timber. Her mother, Elsa, tended a small garden where herbs grew in careful rows, their purposes both culinary and medicinal, though in those days the distinction between healing and witchcraft was thinner than spider's silk. From her earliest years, Greta possessed a quality that set her apart from other children, a profound stillness that seemed to draw the natural world toward her like metal filings to a lodestone. While other youngsters chased hoops through the village square or played at being merchants and soldiers, Greta preferred the company of silence and shadow. She could sit motionless for hours, watching beetles navigate the maze of grass stems or observing the intricate construction of spider webs jeweled with morning dew. The village children found her peculiar but harmless. Adults noted her quietness with approval. In an age when children were expected to be seen and not heard, Greta's natural temperament aligned perfectly with social expectations. Her parents viewed her contemplative nature as a blessing, a sign that their daughter possessed the wisdom to listen before speaking, to observe before acting. But wisdom, in the wrong circumstances, can be mistaken for something far more sinister. Greta's connection to the natural world manifested in ways both beautiful and unsettling. Birds seemed to lose their fear in her presence, landing on nearby branches to cock their heads and study her with bright, intelligent eyes. Stray cats would emerge from their hiding places to wind around her ankles, purring contentment. Even the wild deer that ventured to the forest's edge would graze peacefully while she sat nearby, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. Her parents marveled at these displays, interpreting them through the lens of Christian devotion. Surely their daughter had been blessed with the same gentle spirit that had allowed St. Francis to commune with God's creatures. They encouraged her wanderings, seeing in them a pure soul's natural attraction to the divine works of creation. The village of Kleinhardt existed in a delicate balance between the civilized and the wild. Beyond the cultivated fields and neat gardens lay the Dunkelwald, the dark forest, a primeval expanse of oak and ash, where shadows pooled like dark water and ancient trees whispered secrets in languages forgotten by human tongues. It was here that Greta felt most at peace, following paths known only to rabbits and deer, discovering clearings where wildflowers bloomed in spectacular profusion. On one such expedition, in the autumn of her 11th year, fate placed a wounded creature in her path. She found it near a stream that babbled its way through the forest depths, a young raven with a wing bent at an unnatural angle, its black feathers dulled by pain and exhaustion. Most children would have fled from such a sight, for ravens were universally regarded as harbingers of death, creatures that fed upon battlefields and marked the presence of dark forces. But Greta saw only suffering that demanded compassion. She approached slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening, speaking in the same gentle tones she used to comfort human companions. The wounded bird regarded her with eyes like polished obsidian, neither fleeing nor attacking, as if recognizing a soul incapable of cruelty. Over the following weeks, Greta returned daily to the forest clearing. She brought scraps of bread saved from her own meals, fresh water in a small clay vessel, and most importantly, the gift of her presence. She would sit beside the injured raven for hours, speaking to it in soft, melodic tones about the changing seasons, the patterns of clouds overhead, and the small events that comprised her young life. To any observer, these one-sided conversations might have seemed like the innocent play of a lonely child. But in the superstitious climate of 17th century Europe, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was constantly contested, such behavior carried implications that could prove deadly. As autumn surrendered to winter, the raven's wing healed under Greta's patient care. Yet the creature did not depart as she had expected. Instead, it began to follow her on her woodland excursions, sometimes perching on her shoulder, sometimes flying overhead in lazy circles. She named it Schatten, shadow, for the way it seemed to glide soundlessly through the dappled light beneath the forest canopy. Their friendship deepened with each passing day. Schatten would appear at the forest's edge when Greta emerged from the village, greeting her with soft croaks that sounded almost conversational. The bird learned to recognize her voice from great distances, responding to her calls with an enthusiasm that bordered on the human. To Greta, these interactions represented the purest form of communication, two souls connecting across the species divide through nothing more than mutual affection and understanding. She began to confide in Schatten, as she might have confided in a trusted friend. She shared her small joys and sorrows, her observations about the adult world that often seemed harsh and incomprehensible, her dreams of traveling beyond the narrow confines of village life. The raven listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, occasionally tilting its head or shifting its position as if processing her words. Winter deepened, and Greta's visits to the forest became less frequent as snow blocked the familiar paths and bitter cold made extended outdoor stays dangerous. But even during the harshest weather, Schatten would sometimes appear at the edge of the village, perched on fence posts or church eaves, watching over his human friend with what seemed like protective vigilance. It was during one such winter vigil that the first seeds of suspicion were planted. Agnes Kohler, the village washerwoman and self-appointed guardian of moral standards, noticed the large black bird that seemed to haunt the vicinity of the Lenz household. She observed how it appeared to watch the comings and goings of the family with unusual interest, how it remained fearless in the presence of humans who would normally send it fleeing. Agnes had lived through the devastating plague years, had buried 2 husbands and 3 children, had witnessed enough suffering to convince her that malevolent forces were constantly at work in the world. To her eyes, trained by loss to see omens in every unusual occurrence, the persistent presence of a raven near a particular household suggested only one possible explanation: witchcraft. But Agnes was a cautious woman, wise enough to know that accusations required evidence and witnesses. She began to watch more carefully, taking note of when the bird appeared and under what circumstances. She enlisted other village women in her observations, gradually building a network of surveillance that would soon focus its scrutiny on an innocent child whose only crime was showing kindness to a wounded creature. As winter gave way to spring and Greta renewed her daily pilgrimages to the forest, Agnes and her confederates documented every interaction between girl and bird. They noted how Schatten seemed to anticipate Greta's movements, how the creature responded to her voice, how their relationship appeared to transcend the normal boundaries between human and animal. In their growing paranoia, these observers failed to see the simple truth that Greta had rescued an injured creature and earned its lasting gratitude. Instead, they perceived a supernatural bond between a potential witch and her demonic familiar, a relationship that posed a direct threat to the spiritual and physical welfare of their community. The trap was being set, though neither Greta nor her parents recognized the danger. In their innocence, they saw only the continuing blessing of their daughter's special affinity for God's creatures. They could not imagine that this gift, which brought such joy to their family, would soon be transformed into evidence of the darkest evil. As spring blossomed into summer, and Greta's friendship with Schatten became increasingly visible to the community, the whispered conversations grew more frequent and more pointed. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would destroy not only a young girl's life, but the very soul of the community that raised her. The child who spoke to shadows was about to discover that some conversations carry a price higher than any innocent spirit should be asked to pay. The summer of 1672 arrived with a beauty that seemed almost mocking in hindsight. Fields of golden grain swaying in gentle breezes, wildflowers painting the meadows in brilliant hues, and skies so blue they appeared to have been painted by angels. Yet, beneath this pastoral perfection, something darker was stirring in the hearts of Kleinhardt's inhabitants. The first public manifestation of the growing suspicion came during the feast of St. John, when the entire village gathered in the square to celebrate the longest day of the year. As tradition demanded, the young unmarried women wore crowns of wildflowers and danced around the ceremonial bonfire while the community sang ancient hymns. But even as voices rose in harmony toward the star-filled sky, eyes were turning toward 12-year-old Greta Lenz with expressions that held more questions than kindness. She stood at the edge of the celebration with her parents, her flower crown slightly askew, her movements graceful but somehow separate from the collective joy surrounding her. High above the festivities, barely visible against the darkening sky, Shatton traced lazy circles, his presence known only to those who had learned to watch for such signs. Agnes Kohler leaned close to her neighbor, Martha Brenner, her voice barely audible above the singing. The washerwoman's words carried like poison through water, spreading from ear to ear with the efficiency of all dangerous gossip. She spoke of unnatural friendships, of creatures that should fear humans, but instead sought their company, of ancient warnings about the ways evil spirits deceived innocent communities. Father Heinrich, the village priest, noticed the subtle change in atmosphere, as surely as he might have sensed a shift in weather. The devout man had shepherded this flock for nearly 2 decades, and his experienced eye could detect the first stirrings of spiritual unrest with the same sensitivity that farmers could predict storms. After the celebration ended, and the villagers dispersed to their homes, he found himself troubled by dreams filled with dark wings and ancient fears. As summer progressed, the accumulation of observed incidents began to form a pattern that seemed undeniable to those predisposed to see supernatural significance in natural events. Young Wilhelm's prize rooster, which had crowed faithfully each dawn for 3 years, fell silent for a week after Greta was seen walking past the family's coop. Old Henrik's milk cow, previously docile and productive, became skittish, and her milk soured inexplicably following an encounter with the girl and her avian companion. Each incident, viewed individually, could be explained by coincidence or natural causes. Roosters sometimes fell ill, cows occasionally produced bad milk, and the mysterious ways of animal behavior had puzzled humans since the dawn of domestication. But in the fertile ground of a community's mounting anxiety, these separate events began to connect like constellations in a night sky, forming a picture that grew more ominous with each passing day. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Conversations that had once flowed naturally when Greta was present became stilted and brief. Neighbors who had previously greeted the Lenz family with warmth now offered only curt nods and averted eyes. The village children, sensitive to adult moods in the way that young creatures always are, began to exclude Greta from their games without quite understanding why. For Greta herself, this social isolation was bewildering and painful. At 12, she was old enough to recognize rejection but too young to comprehend its source. She began to spend even more time in the forest with Shatton, finding in her feathered friend's consistent affection a refuge from the growing coldness of human society. This increased withdrawal only served to confirm the suspicions of those who watched her movements with hostile eyes. The breaking point came on a sweltering August afternoon, when the heat lay over Kleinhart like a suffocating blanket. Greta had sought relief in the cool shadows of the forest, sitting beside her favorite stream while Shatton perched on a low branch nearby. She was speaking to the raven about her confusion over the way people had begun to treat her, her young voice heavy with hurt and incomprehension. "I don't understand, Shatton," she whispered, her words barely audible above the gentle murmur of flowing water. "What have I done wrong? Why do people look at me as if I frighten them?" The raven cocked its head, regarding her with those bright, intelligent eyes, and released a soft croak that seemed almost like a response. To Greta, it felt like the comfort of a friend acknowledging her pain. To the hidden observers who had followed her into the forest depths, it appeared to be something far more sinister, a conversation between a human child and a creature that should not possess the intelligence for such communication.
But the priest also understood the broader context in which these events were unfolding. The region had experienced a series of poor harvests, unseasonable weather, and livestock diseases that had strained the community's resources and tested their faith. In such circumstances, people naturally sought explanations for their misfortunes, and the presence of suspected supernatural influence provided a focus for their fears and frustrations. The decision to proceed with a formal investigation was not made lightly. Father Heinrich spent the night in prayer, seeking divine guidance for a situation that would forever alter the life of an innocent child and the character of the community he served. By dawn, The weight of his responsibilities had convinced him that the accusations must be taken seriously, even if he privately harbored doubts about their validity. The wheels of justice, medieval in their design but ruthless in their efficiency, began to turn. Within days, official notice would be given to regional church authorities. Investigators would be dispatched from the bishop's office, and the full apparatus of witchcraft prosecution would focus its attention on a 12-year-old girl whose only crime was showing kindness to a wounded bird. As the late summer sun cast long shadows across Kleinhardt's cobblestone streets, few residents understood that they had just set in motion events that would stain their community's soul with innocent blood. They believed they were protecting themselves from evil, unaware that they were about to become the very evil from which protection was needed. The girl who spoke to shadows was about to learn that in a world consumed by fear, even whispers could be heard as screams. The autumn of 1672 descended upon Kleinhardt like a shroud, bringing with it the chill of approaching winter and the far colder touch of institutional suspicion. The wheels that had been set in motion by village gossip and parental fear now moved with the inexorable momentum of centuries-old legal machinery designed to root out supernatural evil wherever it might be found. The formal investigation began on September 21st, the feast day of St. Matthew, when Brother Aldrich arrived from the episcopal seat in Würzburg. He was a man shaped by decades of theological study and inquisitorial experience, his gaunt frame draped in the somber robes of his calling. Behind wire-rimmed spectacles, his pale eyes held the cold certainty of one who had devoted his life to combating the forces of darkness, wherever they might manifest themselves in God's creation. Brother Aldrich's arrival transformed the investigation from village suspicion into official church inquiry. He brought with him the authority of canon law, the weight of ecclesiastical precedent, and most ominously, copies of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, that detailed the proper procedures for identifying and prosecuting those who had made compacts with Satan. The transformation of Kleinhardt under the Inquisitor's presence was swift and profound. The village that had once hummed with the quiet rhythms of agricultural life now buzzed with nervous energy as residents found themselves either potential witnesses or possible suspects in a drama whose outcome could determine the spiritual fate of their entire community. Greta herself remained largely unaware of the forces gathering around her. At 12, she possessed neither the experience nor the cynicism to recognize the signs of systematic persecution. She noticed that people stared at her more than before, that conversations ceased when she approached, that even shopkeepers served her family with obvious reluctance. But in her innocent interpretation of adult behavior, these changes seemed like yet another inexplicable mystery of the grown-up world. The first phase of the investigation focused on gathering testimony from community members who claimed to have witnessed supernatural behavior. Brother Aldrich conducted these interviews with methodical precision, recording each statement in careful Latin script that would later be reviewed by higher church authorities. The accusations, when laid out in formal language, took on a weight and credibility that mere gossip could never possess. The autumn of 1672 descended upon Kleinhardt like a shroud, bringing with it the chill of approaching winter and the far colder touch of institutional suspicion. The wheels that had been set in motion by village gossip and parental fear now moved with the inexorable momentum of centuries-old legal machinery designed to root out supernatural evil wherever it might be found. The formal investigation began on September 21st, the feast day of St. Matthew, when Brother Aldrich arrived from the episcopal seat in Würzburg. He was a man shaped by decades of theological study and inquisitorial experience, his gaunt frame draped in the somber robes of his calling. Behind wire-rimmed spectacles, his pale eyes held the cold certainty of one who had devoted his life to combating the forces of darkness, wherever they might manifest themselves in God's creation. Brother Aldrich's arrival transformed the investigation from village suspicion into official church inquiry. He brought with him the authority of canon law, the weight of ecclesiastical precedent, and most ominously, copies of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, that detailed the proper procedures for identifying and prosecuting those who had made compacts with Satan. The transformation of Kleinhardt under the Inquisitor's presence was swift and profound. The village that had once hummed with the quiet rhythms of agricultural life now buzzed with nervous energy as residents found themselves either potential witnesses or possible suspects in a drama whose outcome could determine the spiritual fate of their entire community. Greta herself remained largely unaware of the forces gathering around her. At 12, she possessed neither the experience nor the cynicism to recognize the signs of systematic persecution. She noticed that people stared at her more than before, that conversations ceased when she approached, that even shopkeepers served her family with obvious reluctance. But in her innocent interpretation of adult behavior, these changes seemed like yet another inexplicable mystery of the grown-up world. The first phase of the investigation focused on gathering testimony from community members who claimed to have witnessed supernatural behavior. Brother Aldrich conducted these interviews with methodical precision, recording each statement in careful Latin script that would later be reviewed by higher church authorities. The accusations, when laid out in formal language, took on a weight and credibility that mere gossip could never possess. This examination, conducted by the village midwife under the Inquisitor's watchful eye, represented a violation of privacy and dignity that would be unconscionable by modern standards. Every inch of Greta's young body was scrutinized and cataloged, with particular attention paid to any unusual marks or blemishes. A small birthmark on her shoulder blade and a scar from a childhood fall were both recorded as potentially significant evidence of supernatural influence. More disturbing still was the test for supernatural insensitivity. Using a special needle blessed for the purpose, the investigators pricked each suspicious mark to determine whether it caused normal pain and bleeding. According to demonological theory, areas touched by Satan would be insensitive to physical sensation, allowing trained investigators to identify those who had submitted to demonic influence. When Greta cried out in pain and bled normally from these wounds, the investigators noted this as inconclusive evidence. A particularly cunning witch, they reasoned, might have learned to simulate normal human responses in order to avoid detection. The child's obvious suffering thus became further proof of either her innocence or her sophisticated guilt, a logical trap from which no accused person could escape. The psychological examination proved equally traumatic. Brother Aldrich questioned Greta for hours about her relationship with Satan, seeking to elicit admissions of supernatural communication or demonic instruction. His interrogation techniques, refined through years of experience, were designed to confuse and exhaust the subject while revealing hidden knowledge or unnatural abilities. The questions came in waves, each building upon the last, creating a web of implications that grew more complex with every response. Why did animals seem drawn to her presence? How had she learned to communicate with creatures that should fear human contact? What instructions had she received from her avian familiar? What other members of the community had been influenced by her supernatural powers? Greta's responses, filtered through the terror and confusion of a 12-year-old mind, often seemed to confirm the investigators' suspicions. Her attempts to explain her love of nature and animals were interpreted as admissions of supernatural influence. Her inability to provide rational explanations for coincidental events was seen as evidence of guilt. Even her obvious distress during questioning was viewed as demonic resistance to legitimate spiritual authority.
As the days passed, the investigation's momentum became self-reinforcing. Each piece of testimony seemed to confirm previous statements. Each examination revealed additional evidence of supernatural corruption, and each interrogation session produced new admissions that supported the growing case against the accused witch. The community's mood shifted from suspicion to certainty as Brother Aldrich's investigation progressed. Villagers who had initially harbored doubts about the accusations found themselves convinced by the weight of accumulated evidence and the authority of church officials. Those who might have spoken in Greta's defense were intimidated by the implications of supporting someone accused of consorting with demons. By October's end, the case against Greta Lenz appeared ironclad to everyone except the girl herself and her increasingly desperate parents. The methodical accumulation of testimony, evidence, and expert analysis had transformed a child's innocent friendship with a wounded bird into proof of the most serious supernatural crime imaginable. The stage was set for a trial that would serve not as a search for truth, but as a public demonstration of the community's commitment to purging itself of demonic influence. Justice, in the medieval sense, required not the protection of the innocent, but the elimination of perceived threats to collective spiritual welfare. Brother Aldrich's final report to his superiors would recommend immediate trial and, upon conviction, the most severe penalties available under canon and civil law. transforming unfounded fears into legal certainty, and preparing to claim the life of a child whose only crime was possessing a gentle heart in a world that had forgotten the need of mercy.
This was only the beginning. Greta's silence had become a crime, her kindness a threat, and the village of Kleinhardt, under the banner of God, was slowly sinking into the darkness of fear. But that darkness has not yet passed. The real trial has yet to begin. In the next chapter, we'll witness Greta's descent into the brutal machinery of medieval justice. Interrogations, accusations, and the moment a child is transformed into a symbol of evil. This is not just the story of a girl. It is the story of a world that failed to protect its innocence. To be continued.